All right, so today my presentation's actually on a particular text variant in Genesis 11. So I'm just doing a quick introduction here related to the larger project that ABR is doing. You can go online on our website to find out more about it. The best way to do that is you go in and you type in the word primeval in the search box. That word comes from William Henry Green's article in 1890. Primeval chronology is what he called it, where he made an argument against the chronological interpretation of the text. But that's the way you can take a look at the research that's been done so far. I'm not going to be defending that view today or covering the wide variety. If you're familiar with dealing with these two genealogies, you know that it covers a wide spectrum of disciplines: exegesis, text, literary structure, genre, hermeneutical principles. What kind of hermeneutic do we use to interpret these texts? Non-canonical texts such as Demetrius the chronographer, Josephus, the Book of Jubilees, the Church Fathers, and of course text criticism. So there's a whole spectrum of disciplines, and of course here at NEAS also there's a bearing of archaeology on the question. So there's a lot that goes on here in the discussion of this particular subject. Just as a quick overview, as most of you know, we're going to zero down here on the numbers a little bit from Genesis 5 and 11, the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, and the Samaritan Pentateuch. Here's a typical chart of some of the divergences that are found in the three main witnesses. It doesn't include all the divergences, but just the main fundamental ones. And of course, in the history of the church, there's been debate about adjudicating the textual variants. How do we understand where the variety of numbers came from? And in particular, when they're interpreted chronologically, and of course I'm fully aware that there's disagreement in evangelicalism about that, but fundamentally, if you take the chronological interpretation, you yield different chronologies for both epochs and in totality. So the age-long question has been, where did the textual variants arise? How did they arise? And what are the explanations for them? Again, that's part of the project, is not what I'm going to be talking about today. So we have three main phenomenon that have taken place with the numbers proper, okay? So first, we've got clearly large-scale deliberate alterations of the text. That's clear. They're not just scribal errors, although point two, there are scribal errors in some of them, particularly in the Septuagint manuscripts, because of the number of manuscripts that were produced, particularly by the church. And there's a couple of readings in the MT that I believe are also minor variants, such as Eber's remaining years. And then there's also instances of harmonization, as deliberate harmonization, particularly in the Samaritan Pentateuch. Terah's lifespan is the classic example. It's been reduced to 145 by a Samaritan scribe. And then the post-flood lifespans are harmonized additions to the text. They're not original. They've been added into the Samaritan Pentateuch, and also the remaining years have been deflated. So there's a lot going on in all of this. And one of the issues that arises in the discussion of sorting all this data out has to do with Kanan, the son of Arphaxad, in the Septuagint and also in Luke's Gospel, chapter 3, his genealogy that extends from Jesus back to Adam. So there's been, again, an age-long question about the authenticity of this particular patriarch. Where did his name come from? Is it original? Is it an addition to the text? Is it the result of a scribal error? And so on. A number of different theories have been proposed in the academic literature. So I'm going to ask my friend Don here to hand out a free copy of Bible in Spade to everyone. You can take a copy. In exchange for this freedom, it's not free. If you would sign up for the ABR newsletter, I would appreciate it. You're on the honor system. If you already received the newsletter, you may take a copy of the magazine anyway. And you can follow along. What I'm doing today sort of is in the article that's published here in this issue of Bible in Spade. This is a layman's version article of hopefully a more in-depth one that I would like to publish sometime in 2019. But this is nice because it's got nice pictures in it of some manuscripts that have been discovered and so on. So, Don, thank you for doing that. So my talk has to do specifically with the authenticity of Kanan in Luke 3:36, and then you've got this conflicting witness. Now you'll see that the name is inserted here between Arphaxad and Sheila, and if you take the chronological interpretation, you can see what the numbers are based on that. But regardless, even if you don't follow that interpretation, the question of Kanan's authenticity still exists and needs to be, in my view, adjudicated. It seems like a little esoteric subject, but I think it's of interest. You'll find it in the commentaries, particularly on Luke, different varying opinions about it. So here's where the conflict arises, per se. Maybe not conflict, but conflicting data, maybe is the better way to say it. The first thing we noticed quite obviously is that Kanan is absent from the Masoretic text. He's also absent from the Samaritan Pentateuch. Okay, and in the Masoretic text, it's in four places that Kanan simply is not in the text, and this is something that has to be taken seriously. Obviously, the value of the Masoretic text to us has high importance, and also in the Samaritan Pentateuch as well in Genesis 11 and 10:24. We also have external witnesses such as Josephus in his post-flood genealogy. Kanan is not present, nor is Kanan present in Codex Vaticanus of First Chronicles. Now, Brooke and McLean's text critical work on First Chronicles was done in the 1930s, and there hasn't been an updated one done on the Septuagint since then. But they do follow Vaticanus as being original, and therefore Kanan is absent in their view in the original version of First Chronicles of the Septuagint. As we move on, we also have various church fathers, Theophilus of Antioch, Julius Africanus, and Eusebius. All of them, it appears that Kanan is not in their Septuagint manuscript of Genesis 11, which is quite interesting, the fact that that's not the case. And I'm going to provide a general overview of what I think that reason may be for that later in my talk. Now, conversely, we have, again, in conflict here, quite a bit of data that has Kanan present. And this is where, the problem comes in of trying to sort out, is this individual original? First, we have no manuscript of the Septuagint before the 12th century that excludes Kanan. No extant manuscript. So you can go through Weaver's text critical apparatus, for example, and you can find almost every manuscript known to us contains Kanan in Genesis 11. Add to that, we have Demetrius the chronographer, who wrote in around 220 BC. Comes down to us through Eusebius, but he's very precise in his calculations. He does 3 calculations to the time that Jacob enters into Egypt. He does it from the creation of Adam, he does it from the flood, and then he does it from Abraham's departure for Canaan at the age of 75. And when you do all the matrix of data, his post-flood chronology has to include Canaan in order to be accurate. So while he doesn't mention Canaan, his numbers require that Canaan was in his text. And then we have, compounding the situation even further, the book of Jubilees, which also includes Canaan. And Jubilees is from a Hebrew-based text of Genesis, according to Vanderkam and many other experts on the subject of Jubilees, and he's found in chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. And there's a story of his life there, nestled between Arphaxad and Sheila. Then we go on, we find that he is, in fact, in First Chronicles of Codex Alexandrinus, so that conflicts with Codex Vaticanus. Now, Vaticanus is a century earlier, and that's something that has to be considered when weighing the value of the evidence. And we have Hippolytus of Rome, who is a significant witness, not only because the manuscripts are all the way in Rome proper, they come from the early 3rd century A.D., and he does a genealogy not only of Luke, but also of Genesis 11 and Genesis 10:24. He connects people living in his day to people in Genesis 10. And he mentions Kanan, as does Augustine in the 4th century. So what do we do with all of this data that's available to us as it relates to Kanan? Well, I'm going to give a proposal for what I think may have happened in the transmissional history. And again, no matter what your view may be of interpreting Genesis 5 and 11, a decision should be made as to whether or not Kanan was original to the text. So some have argued that Kanan arose as a scribal error in an early manuscript of Luke. It was picked up from a very similar name in Genesis 5, Kainan, one of the patriarchs who lived before the flood. And then when it got inserted accidentally into the Gospel of Luke, it was universally accepted by the church. And this would have to happen very quickly and very universally throughout the Mediterranean world. And then the church, not in a conspiracy proper, but sort of organically, because there was no central authority structure to control all of this, would have interpolated his name back in the Septuagint, into Jubilees, and the 40 known manuscripts of Luke. This is a common argument that's made to explain Kanan's origin. A scribal error picked up in the Gospel of Luke and then accepted by the church rather universally. Scholars who've argued for this is Andrew Steinman had an article in Jets last year where he challenges the authenticity of Kanan. The creation scientist Jonathan Sarfati Mills did a THM thesis at Dallas Seminary in the late 1970s, and then another writer back in the 19th century have made this same argument. This is the origin of Kanan. There's been other explanations you'll find in some of the literature, some esoteric theories that the Ptolemies were threatening the Alexandrian translators to expand the chronology to equal the Egyptian chronology, and Kanan is a red flag to warn the people of God. You'll find kind of strange ideas like this in the literature. But really those kind of things don't hold up to scrutiny. But this is the most serious explanation to exclude Kanan that I've been able to find. So I thought it would be of interest to us to just sort of take a look at a couple of manuscripts that we find. The first one is the Berlin Genesis Papyrus. It's a very interesting discovery. It's from the late 3rd century AD. It was found in Egypt. It is, in fact, the oldest known extant manuscript that preserves the book of Genesis of the Septuagint, and so therefore its value it has good value to us in terms of understanding the textual transmission of the Septuagint and the book of Genesis in particular. Here's a nice high-resolution photograph from the University of Warsaw from Genesis 34. You'll see that the manuscript is mutilated. This is very common throughout the entire manuscript. A lot of lacunae in it. Some places the text is preserved quite nicely. It's written in a very unique sort of capitalized but cursive script. It's not full cursive, but it's not unsealed text. It's sort of a mix, and it's very difficult to read. So if you go online, you look at it, it's very hard to transcribe. Now, the unfortunate thing is that the fragment that contained Genesis 10 and 11 was destroyed in the Berlin Museum during the Second World War. But fortunately, there was a scholar at the University of Michigan, Henry Sanders, who had photographed and facsimiled it. So I contacted the Berlin Museum and found out that it had been destroyed. Then I contacted Michigan to see if they had pictures or, what's the word I'm looking for? Pictures or, we don't even use them anymore. Yeah, something like that. Thank you. Boy, I tell you, I was stuck there for a minute. But they didn't have it. I ran into a dead end. But I did find a low-resolution version from the book online. You can find this at archive.org. And here is an image of the manuscript of Papyrus 911. And here's the transcription by Schmidt and Sanders, Schmidt was a German scholar. You'll see the text critical reconstruction here. The black is what was extant in the text. You can see that in the folio, and the rest of it is conjectured based on other manuscripts. And you can see 3 instances of Kanan in the text. I don't know if the light is red enough for you. Line 18, line 21, and line 23. So, and it's clearly visible in the text, and 2 of them you can still see now. This is blown up, it's a little bit fuzzy. You can read the bottom one here. You can see the kappa, the alpha, the iota, the nu, alpha, and it's sort of smudged over here. But this one looks really good up top. That's line 20. You could plainly see that's Kanan from Genesis 11. So really cool that we could find this, that this has been preserved. It's sad that it was destroyed, but I was grateful that Schmidt and Sanders at least took photographs of it, and we have it in the text so we can see it. And their reconstruction seems to be pretty good. You can see how difficult this is to read, though. It's interesting how hard these letters are to read. It must have been very difficult for them to transcribe this particular manuscript. Now, so that's just one example from the Septuagint evidence, the earliest one. Here we have from the Gospel of Luke, if you look through the text critical apparati, is that the right word? Apparatuses? Apparati. You'll read in NA 28 the long list of Luke manuscripts that preserve Kanan. Now, what's interesting, we have a deviation here in the spelling. You'll notice the mu on the end here of Kainum, and there's also Kanan. Now, that seems a little bit odd. I haven't figured quite out yet what the origination of the scribal error is exactly. To me, though, that does point more to authenticity and not sort of a universal organic conspiracy to change the name, because you would think if that were the case that the name would be consistently spelled. I'm only suggesting that as a possibility, however. So it's in Sinaiticus, you can see here, and also in Vaticanus. And the NA 28 editorial staff has deemed Kainum the original. Then we have Kanan, which is found in Alexandrinus, and this long list of witnesses from New Testament manuscripts, including a 4th century AD Latin manuscript. So as far as the volume of New Testament manuscripts, it's pretty overwhelming that Kanan was original to Luke. But that's not the only consideration when we're weighing variants. There are other factors that have to be taken into account, but this certainly favors his inclusion. Now, scholars who argue against Kanan's inclusion in Luke hang their hat very heavily on P75. And those of you who may be familiar with that, that is considered the earliest known manuscript of Luke. It is in excellent condition in most places. And if you read through New Testament critical scholarship, you'll read, it's considered 2nd century. There's some new debate about that. A scholar, Brett Nongbury, wants to push it to the 4th century. But nonetheless, there's a pretty good consensus about that. What we're going to do is examine P75 a little bit today. So this is the image that's left of P75 for Luke 3 on the Vatican website. And as you can see, there's very little of it that's visible. There are a couple of letters here from the definite article. You can see the tau up here, and then the Omicron, Upsilon. How Luke wrote the names was to Kanan, to Arphaxad, to Sheila, to Peleg. The son of is the implication. That's how it's translated. But he just used the definite article. He did not write huios as son. It's a shortened version. But you can see here, this only includes Luke 3, 34, and 35, and I don't even know if it includes that much. It's so small. 36 is not even listed on the Vatican website anymore. And so this is problematic because we can't really examine P75 to see if we can see Kanan's missing or not. However, we can draw on some previous scholarship that was done. There's been a number of scholars who have studied P75. I'm going to draw on Martin and Cassar's 1961 work where they document what it is they saw in the P75 manuscript. There are other studies, Comfort and Barrett, Swanson, and a couple of others. They fundamentally agree with each other. There's some disagreements on a couple of the letters, but the agreement is fundamentally the same. So I'm going to follow Martin and Cassar. The yellow is what they record as extant, and the white is conjectured reconstruction of the text. So what we're going to point to here that's of significance, I think, if you go down to line 4, you can see here we have ragu in the Greek, phalanx, peleg, eber, and then it drops down to line 5, and we have here the definite article and then the conjectured reconstruction of Sheila, and then Arphaxad, unmistakably Arphaxad there with his unique spelling. Kanan is absent in this reconstruction. Okay, seems reasonable. Now, as I look closely at this, I was looking for evidence of Sheila here, and there isn't any in any of the academic literature. No one has witness the letters from Shelah being at the beginning of line 5. Then I noticed this large space over here underneath Serug. This line is 29 letters long, and I went through some sections of P75 and counted various widths. It's anywhere from 21 to 31 or 32 letters in width, depending on the size of the lettering. And I thought, well, maybe there's an alternative reconstruction that's possible. And I think it is equally plausible. It's possible that this reconstruction is equally plausible based on the visible evidence. You'll see now under Serug, I have placed Shelah at the end of the line and put Kanan here just to see how the length and widths of the line would fall. Again, there is no visible evidence for Shelah in the manuscript, so we don't know for sure if Shelah was down here at the bottom, or the possibility I'm proposing, perhaps an alternative, can't prove it, but an alternative reconstruction where it's here, and Kanan may have appeared here. Again, all we have for sure is the definite article in the front. So now, the one question that came up for me was, there's 6 letters in Kanan, there's 4 in Shelah. Could it have fit? When you look at P75, you can see quite a bit of variation in the size of the lettering. So I think this is a plausible text-critical reconstruction of this. Now, I'm not suggesting with certainty that Kanan's in P75 because there is no visible evidence for it. But what I am suggesting is that what has been followed in the scholarship, that Kanan is absent from P75, cannot be determined with certainty. And if that is not certain, then that removes P75 from the argument against Kanan's inclusion in Luke's gospel. I'm hoping to publish a more in-depth version of this Beyond the Bible and Spade article to try to make this argument that it's possible. We'll have to do some measurements of the letters in P75 and look at some other areas, but the thought process is this is equally plausible reconstruction of the text. And so therefore, as Gordon Fee concluded in 1966, that his absence from P75 is not demonstrable from the extant text. And that is the conclusion that I've drawn. It's not demonstrable. It's possible, but not demonstrable from the text. And so if one is arguing against Kanan's inclusion in Luke and is using P75 as a witness, if that is now off the table, that takes away from the strength of that argument. Unfortunately, P75 has been ruined in this area, and we don't have any direct evidence. We have to depend on the scholars who have claimed that they've looked at it and reconstructed it. So now, as I was exploring this further, I did not find any other discussions of what I found was another manuscript of Luke, and that is Papyrus 4. Now, this has been dated anywhere from 150 to about 225. There's disputes in the academic literature, but it's somewhere in that range. Maybe a little bit later, unlikely to be earlier. AD 150 is pretty early, probably too early. But you'll find in the academic discussions that sort of date range for Papyrus 4. Now, Papyrus 4 is documented in the raw data, but not in academic discussions of Kanan in particular. So it's just not talked about. But as I want to show you here, we're going to find evidence for Kanan. It's housed in Paris. It's supposed to be a high-resolution image, but it didn't come through very well. And here's some of the dates by a couple of different scholars that have dated it. There's disagreements in the literature. It's not by much, 75 to 100 years. Wasserman has argued that the text itself is very close to Vaticanus and P75. And so that's an argument in favor of its dating of the same time period. Now we're going to look in this section over here to the right. And I'm going to change the image a little bit so you can read it better, and then show you some of the reconstruction that you can see here. We'll start with Jared. We can see a couple of letters from his name. Over here is Enoch. That's pretty clear. You can move up here, the end of Methuselah's name, and here's the theta. You can almost see the mu there, and his definite article. Then Noah's father, Lamech, that's very, very clear, the definite article in 3 of the letters. Arphaxad, unmistakable, his unique spelling, unique name. I thought when I have a son, maybe I'd name him Arphaxad. Wouldn't give him problems at school at all. Now moving up, we've got Shelah right here. We can see the Lambda Alpha Peleg. And moving over here, Eber. And then this beautifully preserved section with Kanan, the definite article, the upsilon, kappa, alpha, and erasure, and then it looks like what is the new. There's no question about it. That is Kanan in Papyrus 4. And so now I found that in the academic literature, but after I looked at the image, so it was kind of exciting. I felt like I found something new, and it turned out it wasn't new. But it wasn't new at all. But it had not been discussed in arguments relating to the authenticity of Kanan. And that's the key here. It was in the literature, and here we have proof positive of it, unlike P75, which we just cannot determine with any certainty. So, as I mentioned, we have this sort of conflicting data that we're dealing with of trying to figure out, well, if Kanan is original to Luke, he's not original in the Masoretic text, but he's in the Septuagint, and he's in this witness, he's not in that witness. What do we do with all of this data? And again, I gave some explanations that I found in the literature, and I just can't explain all of the data. So I have come up with an overarching idea. I think it sort of is drawn out of Old Testament criticism, text criticism from what I've read in the academic literature. I can't prove it because we don't have access to a lot of this stuff before the 3rd century BC. I mean, there's just very little text. I mean, obviously in archaeology we find some Hebrew text, but not manuscripts of the Bible, and certainly not extensive ones. So if you'll follow along with me, I admit here that this is conjecture and it can't be proven, but I'm trying to develop a theory that explains the data. We have all this data. How do we explain it? So we know, and this is a pretty common consensus in the Old Testament text criticism world, that the exile sort of created 3 major archetypes in the Hebrew text: the splitting up of the Israelite community in Israel and Babylon and in Egypt. Of course, they went to other places during the exile, but these are sort of where the 3 archetypes sort of went to. That's the general idea. In Egypt in particular, we know from the Elephantine papyri and the temple there that the Jews were worshiping Yahweh, right? That's the name that they used, as far south as Aswan in the 5th century BC. So this is it's very early. And the Hebrew text behind the Septuagint. We know that they had a Hebrew text in Egypt when they translated the Pentateuch in the early 3rd century BC. So my thought process is, somehow in this matrix is how this problem arose. Here's a very typical representation of the theories behind the development of the text and then its splitting apart. I'm not necessarily advocating this. Is just one representation that you'll find very common of the different archetypes that split up as a result of the Babylonian exile. And then here's another representation, very similar, Egypt, Palestine, and Babylon. And then you can see as things get, we'll talk a little bit, how messy things get with the Septuagint down here at the bottom. The church was had 3 competing texts, as Jerome says, at his time. So I'm suggesting that Kanan, this is a little radical, because you won't find this in the literature that I'm aware of, that Kanan dropped out of a major archetype by means of parablapsis and mental error. And 10 minutes. I'm suggesting this happened very early. The consonantal text is very repetitive in Genesis 5 and 11. So there's, the syntax is repeated over and over again. Very similar. In Genesis 11, the numbers are very similar. So there's a possibility of a slip of the eye and a mental error as the scribe was writing. And of course, I'll have to justify this in an academic paper to show that I've tried to work out. I have about 80% of it worked out. But I think that that's what happened. And then to compound things, the only way to account for Genesis 10:24 and 1 Chronicles is to surmise that when they discovered that Kanan was missing in Genesis 11, they harmonized the text. It's really the only way that I think it could have happened, because you can't say that there were all scribal errors, that Kanan fell out of all these verses by accident. That's just not a feasible idea. But we would call this benevolent harmonization. That is a phenomenon in scribal activity. Again, I admit we can't prove this, but it could be the explanation for why that Kanan fell out, and then it was harmonized internally by scribes in the other texts. Now, this main line would have had to have preceded the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Masoretic text, because it's not in the Samaritan Pentateuch, and this compounds the problem even further. So my thought has been, if I'm right, this had to happen very early in the transmissional history of the text. Now, conversely, it's pretty certain the Alexandrian translators had a text, the Hebrew text with Kanan in it. There's no explanation for its existence, his existence in Genesis 11 and 1024 in all of these Septuagint manuscripts. We also have Demetrius the chronographer, which I mentioned before. That's a witness to the Septuagint, so that it was early. He's the earliest witness to Genesis and 5 and 11 that we know of. And then what really, really makes it interesting is Kanan's presence in the book of Jubilees. This is fascinating because some of the Ethiopian manuscripts, which are much later, have Kanan in them, which is a fascinating development. So was his name originally Kanan? Richard Bauckham wrote an article in 1991 arguing that perhaps this was the original name, not Kanan, but Kanan, which is fascinating because we find this in the Luke manuscripts, and the N828 editors deem Kanan the original in Luke 3. So this archetype perhaps being split off very early perhaps is what explains this matrix of data. And then to make things even more complicated, we also know from the academic literature that the translation of the rest of the Septuagint was not done in Alexandria. It was done later, all the way down to about 130 is the date that Peter Gentry argues for, perhaps in Israel. So maybe they were working with a Hebrew archetype that was different than the one that was used by the Alexandrian translators, and therefore may have not originally been in the Septuagint's original version of 1 Chronicles. So if you're not completely confused by this point, then we can go on and add to this matrix Jewish recensional and retranslation activity that began in the 2nd century BC down into the era of the church, where they were updating their translations. Think of it as, hey, listen, we had the King James, now we want to update to the ESV, we want a better translation, we're using what we believe are better Hebrew texts to do so, and therefore the texts were often changed in the direction of the Proto-Masoretic text. So this really, really messes up all the data. This is very complicated. All of it is very complicated. But again, I think is what explains the data the best, is the mess that was created by this. And as you can see down at the bottom here, this is sort of the understanding, the standard understanding of the translation and dissemination of the Septuagint. And once you get into the church era, it gets even messier because you've got the Jewish recensions, Aquila, Symmachus, Theodotion, and you've got 3 texts that the church was debating about. So there's a lot going on here that 5 minutes that is happening, and probably, in my view, explains why Theophilus, Africanus, and Eusebius didn't have Kanan in their Septuagint text, because there was harmonization, retranslation, all kinds of stuff happening, but Hippolytus and Augustine did have his name. And then Luke, well, what text was he drawing on? Well, the easiest text to draw on to do his genealogy would have been 1 Chronicles. He could have used Genesis 11, but 1 Chronicles would have been the easiest text to use in terms of just copying the names, because he wasn't recopying the ages or the lifespans or any of that. So it's possible that Luke was using a Septuagint text. It doesn't look like he was using a Hebrew text, according to some of the scholarship I've read on that. So, I'm arguing at this point, and I'm certainly open to changing my mind on this because, again, I don't have direct evidence of all of it, but I think that instead of being definitive evidence against Kanan, the textual complexities, the external witnesses actually might support a larger argument favoring his inclusion. And of course, this needs to be worked through possibly in the original Hebrew, and I'm pretty persuaded that Kanan is original to the Gospel of Luke based on the weight of the evidence, the amount of evidence that is available to us. So the theory that Kanan originated as a scribal error in Luke, I don't think can be sustained. I think it's impossible, especially when you look at the witnesses before the era of the church, Demetrius and Jubilees and the Hebrew text underlying the Septuagint. I just don't see how that can work based on all the evidence. And so it leaves us with, this is my theory as to the deal with Kanan. I'm certainly open to another theory, but I haven't found one. So unless I come up with another imaginative idea, this is kind of the angle that I'm going to pursue with it. And so hopefully we'll publish another article coming up this year and complicate the situation much further than it already is. So thank you. Do we have any time for questions?
We have about 2-3 minutes.
Oh, my goodness. Steve?
Just quickly, do you think that, therefore, with the exception of Josephus, that this could point, let's say, to the 150 to 200 age period of when this was done?
See, now you're adding another complicating factor because, see, if you read through the academic material on Josephus, most people think, well, he was just following the Septuagint because he uses the higher begetting ages. But when you read the Josephus material, they argue that he had a Hebrew text of Genesis when he was writing his text. So that's another interesting point that's mixed in there. And of course, that makes sense that Kanan was missing if he was in fact using Hebrew text. It would have been long gone in his Hebrew text. So